a big part of ecosystem-based management is humility. We have to be humble enough to say we don't know everything. We will never know everything. And we've got to be open to new knowledge and keep talking about it. And humility comes into play even in the decisions that we make. We go out and say, here's what we're going to do on this piece of land. We can't keep saying we've got it this time. We know we're right.
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph. On this podcast, we talk about environmental sciences in an attempt to try to find a more sustainable way forward. So today's conversation is with David Andison. David Andison, I've had on in the past. We talked about ecosystem-based management, and he's an adjunct professor for the University of British Columbia, and he also is the lead for the Healthy Landscapes program for FRI research. So he's trying to find a landscape ecology method by which to manage our landscapes, right? To be more ecological in our ideas of management. And I brought him on to talk about how do we define a healthy landscape? What does that mean? What are the parameters by which we understand what health in a landscape means, what health in a forest means? And how do we strive to achieve that? How do we work together? How do we bring the conservationists and the foresters and the biologists and the geologists and bring everybody together on the same table so that we can achieve landscape ecology and forest health in the truest sense, right? So we talked, what we really got into, what the catalyst was for this conversation was he released a webinar for forest professionals called How Much Old Growth is Too Much, which is a catchy term. Gets people listening. That is for sure. So we got into serial stages, kind of. So we got into age groups and what the forest should look like. How much of each age class of forest should we have, and do we have an imbalance? Which turns out we do. So you're gonna want to check that out. And it's really, really interesting conversation. We went deep into the philosophy behind why we do some of this stuff, why we manage, how we can manage, how we know we're doing the right thing, how we can come together to do it better, and how we always need to be challenging ourselves and challenging our viewpoints and changing the way we do things in order to do the right thing, because our understanding is constantly changing. So it's a great conversation. David's an awesome dude. Really appreciate him coming on. It was a great conversation. And sponsors for today, Greenlink Forestry is the original sponsor. Thanks so much to Greenlink for all the support. This wouldn't be possible without them. And Damage Timber is another sponsor, longtime sponsor. They are a clothing company out of Edmonton, Alberta. They're supporting environmental sciences through the sale of their clothing. They provide 10% of all the sales that they make go towards a scholarship for environmental sciences students, and they're registered as 2% sustainable and all that kind of good stuff. Check them out at damagetimber.com. Really cool company, and they're doing lots of great stuff. Check them out. And the most important sponsor for 2019, in which this podcast definitely would not be possible this year, is West Fraser, and their funding is coming through the Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta. So thank you so much to West Fraser for all the great work that you are doing to, strive for better ecology, better forests, better forest management. I really appreciate all their support, and thanks so much. So without any further messing around, let's get into it. David and I talking about old growth forests, healthy landscapes, and what all that looks like. Let's do this. Here we go. So I thought a good place to start would just be to start how did you get into dedicating your life to like environmental sciences, and what's the story behind that? Just to open things up, get people to know you a little bit, because I don't know you either really. When we talked, we just jumped straight into the conversation because we were kind of time constrained.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, two different things happened. I suppose the undergraduate degree was forestry in Toronto, and that was a friend of the family who was a professor, and he was very engaging and convincing, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And after spending quite a bit of time with him on family vacations and so on, I just thought, I want to be like him.
Nice.
He was sort of a hero.
Yeah.
And I got into forestry, and I really enjoyed it, enjoyed the people, enjoyed the passion. I still have friends. That was in the early 80s.
Yeah.
I still have friends from that. And you bond so much when you go through an experience like that. So that was the undergraduate degree. And as a part of that, just by chance, my summer jobs were fighting fires in Ontario, and then doing fire research and growth and yield and so on.
Yeah.
And then fast forward 20 years later,
Yeah.
I actually went back to school for architecture.
Oh,
at UBC.
Okay.
That's how I ended up on the West Coast. And after working for an architect and doing part of the courses, I realized this is not the life for me. I really enjoyed it,
Yeah.
but it wasn't a career I wanted to follow.
Yeah.
But what I discovered is, believe it or not, the alignment of a lot of the philosophical literature between architecture aligned with what at the time was a fairly new field called landscape ecology, which we all know what landscape ecology is now, but in the early 90s, it was a brand new, and there were a handful of people who were doing it. And it was fascinating how, as I said, how much the alignment of the ideas was. And, for the most part, it was, this is part art and part science. This isn't just about, understanding, how much wood is in the forest and how fast it grows and which species are there. There's a lot of design to it. And so I transferred into a master's program, which became a PhD program, and I just loved it. And I didn't really think about what am I going to do when I finish. I just thought, this is fantastic. If school was this much fun when I was an undergrad or in high school, I would have been getting straight A's. Which I didn't.
For sure. Yeah.
But in grad school, I did.
Right.
Because I loved it.
You're totally engaged at that point. Yeah.
Absolutely. It just was me.
Yeah.
And I started working almost by even before I finished my PhD, just by accident. There was only, at the time, maybe 5 of us in Canada who were, there was no landscape ecology program. There were no professors even in Canada.
Right.
I sort of put my team together for my PhD in bits and pieces, and some of them from the US. And so by the time the idea caught on, there were maybe 5 qualified people in Canada.
Right.
So I just started doing contracts.
Early adopter.
Yeah, but not by design.
Right. So how would you describe the difference between landscape ecology and forestry? Because my mind, like classical forestry, right, is that you're very much your timber cruising, your how much volume, how do we, get this to the mill, how do we get this growing back, and kind of leave it at that, right? But it's definitely evolved from that. So would you say is there still a dividing line there, or has it kind of become more of the same?
It's always been a separate entity.
Yeah.
And so I would say, if anything, the idea of forestry is within landscape ecology.
Sure.
But so is soil management. So is, firefighting. So is, classical ecology. So is wildlife biology. All of those things are within landscape ecology. Landscape ecology is sort of a collector of all other ideas. It's almost like I would say the closest thing to landscape ecology is like a geographer who actually looks at very, very large scales, but also very, very fine scales.
Okay.
And all other professions within it.
Right. You're trying to bring each individual study into context with the adjacent studies, so that you have a full picture, a mosaic, and not just one fixed viewpoint, I guess.
Well, I mean, by definition, landscape ecology is about the ecosystem, right? And so, arguably, forest management is about one part of the ecosystem.
Sure.
Fisheries is about one part of the ecosystem. as I said, soil management is about one part of the ecosystem.
For sure.
The idea of landscape ecology is sort of to collect them all together and talk about the system, which is an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Which is really complicated. Right? It's a big bite, not a small one.
For sure. No, and that's what fascinates me is the landscape ecology side of it. And I honestly didn't really know how to define it until that makes sense. Like I always had those thoughts, but the definition of landscape ecology, like, okay, that's kind of what I always imagined was forestry, but you're right. I understand what you're saying. It's like it's definitely more defined.
Yeah.
So, no, that's cool.
Well, I mean, the history of it is really interesting because it's the root of it is some German word that I can't pronounce, but essentially, in medieval times, towns that fought with other towns they were sustainable by definition because they controlled a certain amount of land around them.
Right.
And they had to be good at it.
Right.
And it had to be truly sustainable on all of it, not just timber,
right.
or they died.
Yeah.
And that's, classic landscape ecology is that if we don't look after the ecosystems, we're going to die.
Yeah. Doesn't matter how much money you're bringing in, how the economy's working. If the resources you depend on just start to fall apart. Yeah. No, for sure. Well, that makes sense. Okay. So going from landscape ecology and starting to, I want to try and define, because you're the lead at the Healthy Landscapes program for FRI research.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
And so the healthy landscapes is a really interesting term because I'm trying to figure out I think we all want that. Everyone working in environmental sciences, and whether you're fisheries or forestry or whatever, we want healthy landscapes. We want sustainability. We want the maintenance of what we have going on right now. But we also seem to think that we know what a healthy landscape is. And that's where I kind of want to dive into today is what is a healthy landscape and how do we define it, right? Because I think a lot of what we do is we look at, in the 50s, the grizzly bear population was this, and we need to get back to that, right? And it's like, well, was that a historic high or historic low? Was that a good baseline? Where you know what I mean? And because I think you would agree, landscapes are not static, right? Like they're constantly changing and evolving, and it's fluid. It's a very fluid system.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you look at it from a long way back. So how do you go about measuring a healthy landscape? What's the first step to that?
Well,
like I said before,
is that all you want to know?
This is the impossible question, and we're going to try to suss out the impossible answer. And it's I don't know. It's a thought provoker, right? Because I think that's what we all want to know. Right?
Well, Aldo Leopold, one of his quotes that I really like is he said, "Cogs on wheels." You want to keep all the cogs on wheels of an ecosystem. You want to keep all the pieces. You want to keep it as diverse as you can, but not in an unnatural way. So a healthy ecosystem is one, within ecosystem-based management, which is sort of I would say the management paradigm associated with landscape ecology loosely.
Yeah.
Says, a healthy ecosystem is one that has, fully function and provides all the services that it has in the past, and homes for all of the species. Mm-hmm. You don't want to lose anything out of it.
Right.
So that's the conceptual piece.
Yeah.
How that relates to reality is, for the most part, it's been translated into understanding how ecosystems have worked in the past, mm-hmm. and their dynamics. And as you said, they're dynamic over time and space. Mm-hmm. And that's a big part of it. So mm-hmm. how are they dynamic over time and space? So the first step is they change. Mm-hmm. And that's a tough concept for a lot of people to accept. They see their beautiful landscape and they think, this is a healthy landscape and I want it to be healthy forever. Meaning, mm-hmm. I want it to look like this forever.
Especially if you have a specific hiking trail that you love, that your family, your grandparents took you on, and you took your kids on, and or whatever, right? A specific fishing hole or whatever, right? Like people are tied to those memories in a very nostalgic way.
Yeah. Or your favorite fishing hole, or the place where you hunt all the time and you know that you can always get game there.
Yeah.
And in fact, a healthy ecosystem is one that is changing. That it's going to be constantly in motion, mm-hmm. and it's just something that we can't see because in our lifetime we tend to see dynamics happening there either very slowly
Mhm.
or very quickly, and in our mind destructively. So fires.
Yeah.
And in most parts of Alberta, we're talking about fires as the active ingredient here.
Mhm.
It's the reason for that's how forests change,
Mhm.
and so it's a big part of that process.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's all about it. It's not all change that's good. There are different forms of change, different forms of disturbance, and so the concept that we've fallen back on is, if we understand what's happened historically, that defines a range of dynamics.
Yeah.
And that's the range in which Mother Nature has functioned. So it's not random. You can't
Right.
just have change and say it's good.
This is good change, right?
So if we understand what's happened for the last few hundred or few thousand years,
Mhm.
that gives us some thresholds. Say that the system has never gone below this number or above this number, and that's where it's sitting. That's a good place to start
Mhm.
for how we want to keep that system looking in the future. And
Okay.
we see lots of examples already of how we have landscapes that have moved beyond that range.
For sure.
Like,
Like what, for example?
well, the obvious one is old forest, and that has several implications. If you move from having, let's say, historically, the amount of old forest has been from, let's say, 5 to 20% of the landscape, and you're sitting at 30 or 40%, then that's outside of the range, and it's usually associated with higher levels of risk for something else. And in this case, the obvious one is greater risk of forest fires and mountain pine beetle
Mhm.
and other natural insects and diseases.
Mhm.
But the other side of that is, if you've got a lot of old forest, you don't have much young forest.
Yeah.
And that's a habitat type.
Yeah.
And so if you take a look at and I don't want to focus on old forest necessarily, but again, if you step back and look at the landscape, you have an imbalance relative to that which existed in the past.
Right.
And anytime that happens, whether it's old forest, whether it's species composition, whether it's the density of the forest, there's all sorts of ways that we measure it in landscape ecology, of taking a look at patterns of the forest at different scales.
Yeah.
If you wander beyond the historic levels, then the species, the residents, they don't recognize it.
Yeah.
It's something that's unfamiliar to them,
Mhm.
and they're likely to respond in a negative way. And in fact, I can't think of a positive response to that other than invasive species. Right?
Sure. No, that makes sense. And so, and before we get too deep into it, this is like 7 different questions I want to unpack in there. And I just want to try to set it up a little bit more, to try and define that those parameters by which you said there's a high and there's a low, and we know this because of research and whatever. How do we know? I guess like that's just the best picture we have, right? That's the best thing we have to go off of to decide what a healthy landscape is. We don't necessarily know definitively that it should be in there, but we have to start with something, and that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, there are definitely different levels of engagement where you could use that information for either management decisions or policies.
Right.
So, for example, the entire Quebec Forestry Act is now based on the principles of staying, they call it closer to nature.
Okay.
And so the idea there is, if we understand where we sit now and where we look in the future, and it could be, the patch sizes of older forest, it could be edge density, it could be, amount of different forest types, as I say, on very, very broad scales. Those are the simple ones. Interior forest. If we understand where we sit today and where that landscape sat historically, chances are, and for most of those, there's going to be a difference, and we're outside of those boundaries.
Right.
So the first level of engagement is, let's stop the forest from moving away from its historic range, and if possible, start to move it back towards.
Right.
Let's not worry about being within the natural range or even close to the median.
Sure.
Let's just in the bigger picture, let's figure out why it's moving away and start to move it back.
Okay.
So that's I would say generally in Canada we're at level 1 engagement right there.
Oh,
Nothing more
okay.
sophisticated than that is going on.
Okay.
But that's a big step because philosophically we've really switched gears here, right?
Sure. No, that makes sense. I had a good one in there and I totally lost it.
Well, the reason I say that it's a big shift in perspective is that we traditionally manage by managing individual species. So moose, deer, caribou, grizzly bear, bull trout. That's how we direct our ecological values is by individual pieces of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
So this idea of stepping up a whole level and saying those things are still important. We're not ignoring them, but we have to start thinking about the health, looking at the whole system
For sure.
and how that's functioning, because we can still, I can guarantee you there's still a way of creating a landscape that looks good for individual species that is still moving it on a trajectory that's away from anything that resembles something natural.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and like Aldo Leopold said, right? Like those cogs, every single one of those cogs and wheels is important. We can't remove one and expect everything to remain somehow in balance, right?
And we don't even know what those cogs and wheels are. That's the complicated thing about an ecosystem is the number of species that we even have names for is a small fraction of the actual species that exist out there, and let alone understanding their value. I mean, how many years was it when we considered yew trees to be junk trees and we cut them all down, and we didn't understand the chemicals involved in their relationship to cancer. Right. So how many medicinal plants, how many subsurface mycorrhiza are going to be a cure for cancer, or nutritional values, or we don't know.
Yeah, the importance of it we don't really know. We're just breaking the surface of this one.
Yeah. So this is a bit of a leap of faith that says, okay, we can't name or understand or manage every single species in an ecosystem. So this is more of an overview that says, let's just try not to lose anything and keep it in balance with where we understand it was in the past.
Yeah.
Understanding that we're in a period where there is going to be changes to the climate, and climate drives these ecosystems. And for some, that's a reason to say that this idea is, it's invalid because climate's going to change everything.
Yeah, that's a cop out in my mind, right? That's just a laziness thing for me.
Well, it's still the understanding of how ecosystems work and what drives it, regardless of whether or not climate change is going to happen, is still a valuable piece. And I would actually argue, in fact, if we are going to deal with climate change and we don't understand the link between climate disturbance and landscape conditions and the values we get, we have no hope.
No, for sure.
So we have to take that larger scale approach if we're going to make it through this.
I mean, that's a child's view to just be like, well, it's too late, nothing we can do, whatever. I'm going to sit back and not worry about it. It's like, well, that's pretty ignorant and not very, like, you're not working towards a solution. You're not even trying. You're just giving up. It's a weird mentality. It's laziness is what it comes down to, right? That's a strange one to me.
Well, I find it comes down to that this really hits at the roots of personal beliefs,
for sure,
which is really hard to debate, right? It's not.
It is. Yep.
It's not a scientific argument anymore. It's a philosophical one, and it's amazing how quickly and where and in what place you can hit some walls, and where people will just push back and say, no, I don't believe that.
Yeah, well, even climate change is a very basic argument, right? Like, there's plenty of people that firmly believe that it's not real, we're not contributing, and all this kind of stuff. So, and yeah, the philosophical side of it is an interesting one for sure. But I still think that it's to just say I can't be bothered, it's too late. Like, what are you setting us up for here? Like, you're just, you know what I mean?
Well, I would say the people who say that the past is not it doesn't provide us with a template for the future, so we can throw it away. That the alternatives are we should just manage for what we want. So we're sort of revert back to what I call the value-based approach.
Sure.
and we'll just manage for those main values, and it'll be fine. BC a few years ago took an a philosophical approach, where they said we're going to manage to maximize resilience, which is an even vaguer term than ecosystem health.
Yeah.
But the idea there was be prepared for climate change, and underneath all of that is create a dynamic, heterogeneous system, which isn't that much different, essentially.
Yeah, but like you were saying, though, we have to understand it in order to be able to. Sure, maybe I think we know now that the forest of the future is not going to be the forest of the past. I think we know that. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Because of climate change, because of human activity, because of our interaction on the landscape, right? I think that's inevitable, and we both understand that. And I think most people in the the scientific and like forestry community understand that. That doesn't mean we stop trying to go in a direction, right? So, but anyways.
Yeah, there's always, as I say, every province has a plan to deal with it.
For sure.
I would say Ontario and Quebec are the two that took the idea of managing the ecosystem, so an ecosystem-based approach, EBM, as their paradigm. And I would say other provinces are still in the midst of changing, I guess, deciding which way to go.
Yeah.
And not committing just yet.
For sure. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Would you say that, like, most of this change that we're seeing, would you say, because you're saying we're outside of the historical realm, the historical averages, right? Or the historical, I guess, extremes of where the climate or where the forest has sat, right? Where the ecosystems have sat. Where the
for a lot of the pattern variables, yes.
Sure. We're starting to get outside of that historical range.
Yeah.
Would you say what would you say the reason for that is? Why are we getting outside? Is that because of us, or are there natural things that are changing that are causing that?
It's difficult to pick that apart entirely.
Arguably impossible, but yeah.
but I would, so based on most of the research, in my opinion, it would be definitely human imposed. One of them being fire control, and that has a larger impact than most people realize, because it influences the entire landscape, 100% of it. And we have been highly successful at that in the entire Southern Boreal right across Canada for the last 50 or 60 years.
Yeah.
That's starting to change.
Sure.
Because we have these landscapes that are outside of their natural range. The amount of old, dense, and conifer-based forest is beyond its natural range. So when a fire gets going, there's nothing to stop it. When in a natural landscape, you have young forest, you have dense forest, you have open forest, you have conifer, hardwoods, and mixes, and there's some natural breaks. And right now, in a lot of the forest, those breaks don't exist anymore.
Right.
So we're going to see more big bad fires because of that. So that's one big part of it, and the other is what I would call the mechanical human. So forest management is a big part of that, and we have to put roads in for most of it. So we get linear features, and the harvesting patterns historically, I would say until about 5 or 10 years ago, have been the standard checkerboard that you see from the plane.
Yeah.
And that has started to shift, and we can come back to that.
And even that came from a place of the best science at the time, thinking like this is how we can minimize our impact on the landscape and maximize habitat and stuff. And
absolutely,
it looks like garbage now when you're flying over it, but but that was at the time that was leading edge, right?
That's a great point. It was a leading edge science. It was published, and it was for aesthetics. And it was for moose. Believe it or not, in the 1970s, moose was the caribou of today. And in Northern Ontario, they called them moose hotels.
Moose hotels, yeah. And
they were perfect for moose. And that's what I was taught in school. This is the best way of doing harvesting from an ecological perspective and from an economic one. And so look back on those now when we make fun of them, but that was the best available science that we had.
And I think it points out a good fact that, you know, that we're never done this endeavor, right? We're always trying to find a better new way of doing forest management, because we're never going to know all of the variables. And so we have to continue to do research. We have to continue to try to understand them all and adjust course. And we can't ever say, well, we can't do that because it's not in the policy, because the policies need to change. We can't, if the policy is not right, then it needs to be changed, because we need to do what's right. Because ultimately we're all our, not just the economy, not just the industry itself, but our ecology, our landscape is at stake there. So these things need to be fluid and constantly moving, right? Because even back then we thought we were doing the best thing. Turns out, well, maybe that wasn't so great for a few different reasons, right? So I think that's a good point, that it just points out that we should always be moving in a direction of learning and changing the way we do it, and not leaning on, well, it's going to cost jobs or it's going to cost this as a justification, because
it makes excuse me, it makes change hard. And especially when policy becomes hard. Yeah. And it's based on the premise of best available science is a good one. But again, the shift there is that's a dynamic thing in and of itself, as you were saying. So it's not just the landscape that we have to keep moving. We got to keep responding to new information. Yeah. That's really hard, because essentially our institutions, the rules and policies and practices, they're not designed to do that. No. And so
something becomes law and it stays law until there's a giant lawsuit against it or something like that, right?
And change is hard. Yeah. And I know the people in Quebec who were leading the change there from their sort of what I would call traditional forest management system of a value-based one to an ecosystem-based one. They hired 10 specialists, full-time specialists, just to talk to the departments within the Quebec government, nobody else, to explain what it is they're doing and why. And because there was so much pushback on the idea. And this is a common, what we found was actually a common theme, is that the introduction of these different philosophical ideas, there was a lot of pushback, and it requires dialogue. You have to start talking about this even before you do it, not after you've decided to do it and then say, here's a new idea. Yeah. People don't respond to that very well. So so it's I think it's a different world in many ways that we have to keep on our toes. We have to keep on our toes in terms of being I like to say that what a big part of ecosystem-based management is humility. We have to be humble enough to say we don't know everything. We will never know everything. And we've got to be open to new knowledge and keep talking about it. And humility comes into play even in the decisions that we make. We go out and say, here's what we're going to do on this piece of land. We can't keep saying we've got it this time. Yeah, we know we're right.
For sure. Well, and there's plenty of examples on that, right? Of just like we'll do a bunch of work into a specific program that becomes a new policy, right? Like I don't know, like regeneration standards, right? Those only came in 20 years ago, and for the time they were the best thing, and now they probably need to be updated, right? And we can't just say, well, we have that, we figured that part out and we're good now, we can leave that as is. Yeah, it needs to change. Ultimately, it can't be stuck in policy forever and just stuck behind bureaucracy, because ultimately it'll cost us everything if that stays that way.
And you can't let that stop you from making a decision either. And that's the hard part, is it's living in that middle ground where that's where best available comes in. Yeah. And I've had these conversations countless times of, what's good enough? Like, well, my counter to that is, do you need to make a decision tomorrow or next week or next year? And if the answer is yes, you say, well, then we have no choice. You have to use the best available.
No, the best available is the way.
You defend where that comes from. Yeah. and be open about it. And if the best available changes in 5 years, then sure, you'll make a different decision.
Yeah.
But for today, you have no choice. You have
Yeah.
to make a decision. This is what we've got today.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how that can freeze decision making.
Totally.
It's like, well, if we're not sure, then we should just, the tendency is keep things the way they are, right? Because we're not sure. It's like, well, is that any better?
Yeah.
To not change at all?
Well,
as opposed to, again, back to the bigger picture of, we may not have a lot of the details figured out, but the big picture stuff, we're pretty clear on where our landscapes are going, and that shouldn't stop us from,
for sure,
making new policies and practices now.
Oh, for sure. No, as far as managing landscape, I think we're doing it arguably one of the best in the world at managing our ecology and making sure that all the pieces are there, right? We just have a lot of huge hurdles to try to get over right now. And I think, like, I'm very proud of what the environmental sciences community, the forestry community, ecology community has done. I think we're heading in the right direction. I don't want to make this sound like it's a bang on those communities, right?
Yeah.
I just think we need to always be challenging ourselves and making sure that we're doing the right thing, because ultimately, like, when you become, and this is my perspective, right, as a forester, and I guess you were a forester as well at one point, is our ultimate responsibility is to the public, not to the mill that we're working for, not to the government to follow the policy. Our ultimate responsibility is to the public, and make sure that those public resources are well taken care of, right? That's our ultimate goal. And if we're making a decision because it's good for the company or good for the government or good for whatever, then that's the wrong decision, right? And it's hard to know what that decision is, of course, right? There's a million different biased reasons to make a decision or not. But like something my dad always told me, and you know Terry, but
I do.
Yeah,
I know your dad. Yeah.
And something he always told me, and this is before I decided to go into forestry, I think, was that if you think something's right and you can defend it, you can back it up with logic, and you can't find any holes in that logic, then do it. Regardless of what the policy says or the regulation says, if you can defend it and you think it's the right thing to do, then do it, because that's the way society's going to move inevitably, right, over time. So I think as individuals in these industries, I think a lot of people feel beholden to their employer, or beholden to the government, or to do those things because they're in policy or whatever, right? And I think it's good to remind people, like, no, you have to do what's right for the public, and what's right for the public is what's right for landscape ecology, right? Not just what's good for timber, but what's good for timber, what's good for water, what's good for whatever those values equate to, right? And so that's a tough one to try and navigate, because obviously some people might value some things more than others. But I just mean ultimately we're all just people, and we all have to, if we want to see change, we have to be the ones to do it, right? So,
well, I'll share with you a story, and back to your original question of why I do this. Well, here's why I still do this.
Mm-hmm.
This path that we're going down now, a part of it is in policy right now, but I would say not in a big way, of moving towards an ecosystem based approach. But I have a team of almost every forest management company in the province, and including several branches of the government, who come to every meeting, and more recently just sort of gave another big push of support, show of support for the Healthy Landscapes program and the work they do. And it's for that reason, exactly that reason. They want to do the right thing. They don't have to do this.
No.
A lot of the work that we're doing isn't required by law or by policy, but they all want to do the right thing. That's why I'm still here.
For sure.
Because I'm working with people who are just as passionate about it as I am.
Yeah.
That's where I want to be. I don't want to be working on doing research because it's a requirement. We have to do this. So, Dave, here, just figure out what's the best way of doing it, and we'll implement that, and off you go. Right. It's there, and you peel. EBM is an onion that has to be peeled, and it's really cool working with a group that. At every meeting, it's sometimes it's easy in between meetings, and when I don't talk to the partners, to start to get down about things. And at every meeting, there's always, several people step forward and say, "I really believe in this stuff, and that's why I come to every meeting, and that's why we're giving you money."
Yeah,
because this is the right thing to do.
For sure,
and that feels great to be a part of that.
Yeah, for sure. No, I feel the same way. There's very few people I come across who are doing this because it's a paycheck, right?
Yeah.
It's people are in it for the right reasons. They want to see change. And I just think people need to continue to push that, right? Push their beliefs and just their beliefs, their beliefs, and just, keep pushing those boundaries and making sure that you're doing what you think is right and not just what someone's telling you to do, because it's what we do, right?
Yeah.
Doing something because we did it historically, or doing something because it's tradition or whatever, is like that's a dumb reason to do something. You need to be defensible somehow. And I agree. I think almost everybody I come across, right, that's why I have such belief in, I think, these communities, right, is that we're all in it for the right reasons, and we're moving in the right direction. I love it. It's great.
And there's always a bit of mistrust, right? And when you change paradigms and you do it anytime you change a paradigm, there's always mistrust, right? It's like, well, okay, well, what's in it for you, and why are you doing this? And it's worse if you don't talk about it. It's always worse. And so I would say one of the successes we've had in the last couple of years was through the dialogue sessions that we held across the province, and the EBM workshop, which I think you attended.
Yep.
And it's amazing how that just sort of opened up the door for discussion.
Totally.
And it's a start, but all of a sudden the dialogue is continued.
Yeah.
And it's just because you're talking about it and not doing something behind closed doors. As soon as the door closes or there's something that happens, without someone being a part of it, the mistrust factor goes up.
Yeah.
And there's probably nothing going on nefarious there behind the closed door, but why you close the door? Why can't I be a part of that discussion?
Yeah.
So one of the things we discovered with the dialogue sessions and the workshop is that a lot of people want to be a part of this discussion.
Of course they do, because it seems like the way forward, right? And especially when you've got all the stakeholders there, right?
Yeah.
You've got oil and gas, you've got forestry, you've got biology, you've got conservation, you've got indigenous communities. You had everything there, right? So it was a good cross section of forest values in quotations, and what those, how those values are weighted, right? So it was that's the type of stuff I like to see, is those roundtable discussions where everyone's at the table, no one's trying to hide or be against somebody, right? Like, sure, within these communities of conservation and forestry and oil and gas and stuff like that, everyone that's out on the landscape, there's going to be arguments and there's going to be disagreements, but it doesn't mean we can't come to the table and decide what our values are and how we can achieve those, because there's going to be common values for sure.
And those are hard successes to document, right? That's the problem.
Totally.
You can't say, with a classic research project, we did the research, we put in plots and we measured them, and here's our paper and here's our final report, and here's what it means. And there's a nice direct line. And what we found with the dialogue sessions and the workshop is that there's no direct line, but the benefits sort of keep popping up in ways that are unexpected.
Totally.
And I would say that it gained trust for, first of all, I would say the team that worked on it, but at the greater Healthy Landscapes team and the approach they're taking, a lot of people are now, at least the door is open.
Yeah.
And they say, okay, well, I understand what these guys are talking about now, and I understand where they're going. And I may not agree with some of those points, but at least I understand where they're going now.
Yeah, the philosophical change is hard to document for sure, but that's how you change a society ultimately, right? Is just talking about it, the communication. It sounds so benign to say, well, we need to have more communication, we need to bring it to the forefront, we need to talk about it. That sounds like you're not doing anything, but that's how you start something, right? So yeah, totally.
Yeah, and change is I've recognized that there's going to be it's going to be baby steps along the way, because we still got a ways to go before we're truly managing the ecosystem as a single entity. I mean, if you think about it, all of our institutions are set up, our regulatory institutions, our provincial ones, our municipal ones, our federal ones, they chop the ecosystem into pieces.
Totally.
And that's how it gets managed. So
that's how it becomes manageable, right?
Because they were resources, right?
Yeah.
It was based on resources. What's the resource? What's the value that we're going to look after? As opposed to the ecosystem is a value, and we should be looking after that. and there's no one in charge of the ecosystem right now, right?
It's kind of, it's a tough one, because it's, how do you put in this society, right? Everything has to be defensible monetarily, or it's not really considered to be important or valid in any real sense of the word, right? Because everyone will say, oh yeah, the environment's important. Of course it's important, but it's more important that we have money, because without money, we can't do those things. And that's true, but that doesn't mean that you need to have, when does it end, right? Like, you get some money, and at what point do you start putting some of that money towards these things, right? So you need to, at some point now, I think we're starting to get funding for, obviously you're getting lots of funding and people are getting funding to do these things, right? But it's taken a long time to get to that point, and we can't only defend something because of, direct dollars. But arguably, like I'm sure you're about to say, is without good ecology, without the good ecosystem, we don't have any values or money or anything. So
yeah, it's a time thing too, right? We tend to want money now, as opposed to, it's hard to think about a resource that might not be there 200 years from now, or 100 even.
It's hard to invest in ourselves.
It's hard to think about generations.
Yeah.
We can think maybe in terms of our kids, but grandkids, great grandkids, it becomes a lot more difficult, and then it becomes more nebulous. It's like, well, things may or may not get better, so let's just keep doing what we're doing. But
yeah. Anyways, we're getting way out to
lunch.
Yeah,
we did. I just noticed that.
I was like, wait, what are we here to talk about again?
You didn't tell me we were going here.
I didn't know either. Okay, so get back to ecology and landscape ecology, and getting into old growth forests, because old growth forests are the big keyword that I think a lot of environmental groups and a lot of people are grabbing onto as, we need more old growth. Old growth is important. Old growth is important. We're losing it, and these kind of things. So, what is defined as old growth? And you mentioned before that we might have more old growth than historic in the history, right? And then historical variability that previously existed before humans. How do we know that? And yeah, like, how do I don't know. I'm trying to, you know what I'm trying to say.
I'm gonna start out by saying I use the term old forest.
Old forest, okay.
Not old growth. So old
growth is very forestry. Yeah.
Old growth is an ecological term.
Okay.
And it refers to a very specific combination of structural and compositional attributes.
Okay.
So it has multi-layered canopy.
Sure.
It'll have a variety of species. It'll have the density will be variable. There'll be gaps. There'll be dense parts. Vertical and horizontal continuity of fuel types. Even the picture behind you, there's young there's young trees, there's intermediate trees, there's tall trees. So that it generally is the definition of an old growth forest. Old forest is simply forest that hasn't been disturbed in some way for a long time.
Okay.
So in this case, let's just say 120 years.
Sure.
So you can actually get old growth forest in forest that is not old forest. So what I mean by that is, imagine a forest that is, say, 150 years old, or 150 years old, which is very old, and a very low intensity fire goes through and kills maybe 20% of the stems in it. So in terms of timing, that forest would be, a disturbance went through 20 years ago, but in another 10 or 20 years after the fire, it'll probably again have old growth characteristics. So we can create old growth, actually, and fires do all the time. Mother Nature does it all the time. In far less time it takes to have old forest. So my definition, what I'm using, because old forest old growth changes depending on the forest type you're in, the site type you're in, the natural subregion you're in. It can be very, very specific.
Sure. And
that's really hard to nail down.
Okay.
So just to keep things simple, I just use the definition of when was the last disturbance of any consequence on that landscape.
Okay.
And that's easier to track because you can just do it in a GIS exercise.
Okay.
And it's easy to measure.
Right.
So we know from simulation modeling, spatial simulation modeling, when we put in sort of the past attributes of the fire regime, we can come up with an estimate of how much old forest was there, and compare it to how much was there today. And in most cases, the amount of older forest, I'm going to say, is already outside the natural bounds. And in some cases, it depends where you are. So, for example, in a large part of the northern part of the province, the amount of old forest greater than 120, it's not out of the historic range, but the amount of mature forest, the next class down, so let's say 80 to 120 years, is way beyond the natural range. There's a massive amount of it, and we know from fire records that there were a lot of fires back at the turn of the century, and they haven't quite turned 120 yet, but within the next 10 or 20 years they will. They're going to be there. So I would say this pattern repeats itself right across the whole province, is that the amount of forest that is either old now or about to become old is significantly beyond the historic range, and enough so that if you would debate the inputs that went into the modeling exercise, it would take a significant change to change that conclusion.
Okay.
So it's not just out by a little bit.
Okay.
We have massive amounts of older forest, and ironically, but this makes sense. That is even more true in the areas where we're not managing, because we're putting fires out everywhere. We are not.
Those are the places where people are integrated in the landscape. They're scattered throughout.
Well, no, we're not harvesting all parts of the landscape, right? In the northern part of the landscape, we're only, the amount that's available for harvest is only 50% of the forest.
Right.
Which
is what I mean. We tend not to harvest where there's lots of people recreating because people don't like it.
Well, it's low. It's wetland. It's lowland,
okay.
right? So it's just not available for harvesting. Or the trees, it's either sensitive, or the trees are too small. They're not merchantable. So that whole part of the landscape isn't getting any disturbance,
right,
other than the big fires that get away. So imagine, let's say, a black spruce leading type, which is generally associated with high moisture sites, and not being harvested. For example, the historic range of younger forest, it would be in the 30 to 40% range, and in some parts of the north we have only 5%.
Oh,
so think of that as a habitat type.
Yeah,
right. We have in very simplistic terms, if you take an age group, which we call a seral stage, and you take a cover type, just by leading species, black spruce, white spruce, aspen.
Yep.
Those are very generic habitat types, and so those are something that you want to keep in balance on a landscape.
Yeah.
So we've got not just a huge amount of old, but we've got a very, very small amount of young.
Yeah.
So there's a habitat type that isn't even that's barely being represented.
Yeah.
And again, back to the value-based approach, there are very likely, almost guaranteed, species that depend on young forest in wetland habitat types that we don't even know about.
Oh, for sure.
And they're probably at risk now just because we can't identify them.
But they're insect species or plant species that that people don't care about because they're not charismatic megafauna. It's not a moose or a caribou or a grizzly bear. So,
but they might be critical to the survival of those things.
For sure.
And we just don't know enough about them.
Right.
So this is sort of the fail-safe part of the ecosystem-based approach. And on the other hand, we have huge amounts of older forest that's building up, and we're seeing it's the impacts of that are very visible today. We've got mountain pine beetle now that's it's made it past Jasper, it's made it through that pass, it's in Hinton, and now the beetle's just going, okay, which way is next? I'm coming.
For sure.
And it's old dense pine, and that was not there 100 and 200 and 500 years ago.
Right.
That all that yummy food.
That's why we've never seen this. And this pine beetle outbreak is one it's unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this in the historic record. So
it was never in Hinton. It was never in Grand Prairie, ever.
Yeah.
It's made it through because we've created the conditions by which it can make it. Now, climate change has had something to do with that.
Which is also us. So
yeah. But this is one where we know there's an overlay of factors going on there.
For sure.
Happening. And the fire risk, my personal opinion is that we're at the tip of the iceberg. We've got so much dense, highly flammable fuel out there that the fires that we're going to be unable to control are going to be more common. I mean, the Peace River fire is one that we may not fully put out until the winter.
Right. No, same thing with the one up by between Wapska and Slave Lake, right? That one's 260,000 hectares, and it's like, it's not going to be out until the snow comes,
and chances are that a part of it is going to pop up next spring
for sure. Yeah, it's just too big to manage the whole thing.
It'll overwinter, yeah. So I think we just have to get used to that, well, again, we either get used to it or we deal with it, and we can deal with it.
So I know, and I'm kind of going backwards a little bit here, but just to clarify how we know for certain that there is way more of, you didn't say old growth, but the mature growth than we've had in the past. I mean, we likened it to fire suppression, right, and to probably just lack of fire, period, like with indigenous burning and all kinds of stuff like that too, I'm sure. Is there anything else that's like, how can we definitively say that there's more mature trees now? Like the forest is more homogeneous than it has been in the past.
Well, that's a part of it.
Yeah.
Right. That as forests age, they tend to become to a point simpler in terms of composition, and denser. And so when you get fuels that are both vertical and horizontal, that's the worst case scenario for fire. So they, I mean, you're talking about the evidence that suggests that they're older.
My intention here is to say, like, I don't want people to look at this and go like, oh, these guys are just trying to justify logging or whatever, right? So I want people to understand that this is something that we've created, like you said with the pine beetle, we've created this situation that's an artificial situation that wouldn't exist without poor human interaction, right? Unsustainable human interaction. And that because of that, we need to think about this differently and understand that, because I think old growth is romanticized in a very real way, and it's very important. We need it for a lot of species depend on it, of course. But like you said, there's a balance to be struck, because now the species that depend on the young stuff are probably at severe risk, right? There's plenty of bird species that live in that young forest, young aspen forest and stuff like that they now have no place to live, right? And so they die out because of that. So what I'm trying to say is, how can we definitively say that this situation here is because of us and needs to be changed?
Well, I would say this is a discussion that happens right across Canada, and back to the point that we were making about the checkerboard harvesting. At the time being state of the art. Well, putting all forest fires out was state of the art
for sure.
For decades, that was the goal of every fire management organization, and success equaled fewer fires and putting them out. And it's only a very recent idea that fires are actually a healthy, necessary part of the ecosystem. But now the dilemma is it's almost getting too late to put them back on the landscape in terms of fire risk.
It's becoming too volatile now. It's just like,
I mean, I know fire management agencies, those in Alberta included, are very interested in using fire as a tool and using it as a management tool.
They want to, yeah, definitely.
Now the problem is how do we do that, and where are the opportunities? But I would say that's a discussion happening right across Canada. In terms of fire exclusion is a big part of it. Forest management as a disturbance activity, as I said, I think that's transitioned from the checkerboard into essentially what you might see looking out of a plane as in terms of how a fire burns. That's the transition that's happened as a part of this paradigm shift. So that's a very positive thing. But the amount of harvesting that has gone on, just purely in terms of area, is based on, the idea of sustainability from an allowable cut perspective, as you know, is based on how much wood you have, and you harvest the interest out of that. But that's only, anywhere from 40 to 70% of the landscape that we're basing that calculation on.
Yeah, you're harvesting the growth, the yearly growth, annual growth,
but only of that part of the landscape that we call active. Right? We don't. The passive part isn't a part of that calculation.
Yeah, the big burn that just went through is pulled out of that calculation.
Yeah. So the so-called passive part of the landscape, where you have trees that will never be harvested, that are never going to be in the queue, that again, if you step back and look at the whole ecosystem, if we're always very good at putting fires out, and we're only harvesting, even if we're harvesting up to the maximum amount that we're allowed, which, as you know, rarely happens actually with companies, then we're still falling behind, right? We're still, the disturbance rate on the whole landscape is still very low.
Really? Okay.
And so it's sort of, the mathematics works out that you would have to actually have quite a bit of burning on the landscape to make up for that, and we don't have nearly enough
with harvesting. So you're never going to replace burning with harvesting, but you might supplement it a little bit. Yeah.
So we're just the way we're going now is that we're just going to be continually falling behind, and that the current condition of the landscape falling outside of the natural range will just increase over time. It has. There's no way it can't. Unless we start to get more really, really big bad fires, which
we kind of are.
Maybe, but even more. I mean, think about double or triple this summer.
Really?
It happening.
Because we're almost at 1 million hectares in Alberta already.
But that's nothing.
That's
right?
nothing relative to the landscape. Yeah.
These landscapes, I mean, it's from a low of, 65, 70 years in the Northeast to, 100, 110 years in the foothills. And as you move up, you get into 130, 140 years, maybe. But you also, but that's generally areas where we're not harvesting because it's too high. So we're talking about a pretty quick turnaround.
For sure.
So 1 million hectares in 1 year is, it's really not that much.
So what do you think we would need to see in terms of burning on a yearly basis to get back to something that was quote unquote pre-human management? Right?
The best, I don't know. I don't know what it would be. I think, but the best I can give you is that an exercise that we did that included Banff and Jasper National Park, and of course they don't harvest there, but they
harvest. Correction, they do harvest the beetle kill.
Yes, and yes,
because it's a fire risk.
They are doing it now, but they don't generally use it as a disturbance tool.
No,
but they do have burning programs, and for a time there, and that this policy may have changed, they would base the amount of burning they would target on some percentage of what they thought was going to be natural.
Sure.
But it was never 100% because that was just unrealistic. They couldn't do it.
That thought of natural, that baseline that they're pulling it from is it's conceptual. It's not really, it's based in whatever available science there is, but we can't know for sure that that's the right number.
Well, in the parks, it's actually in the montane, in the valley bottoms. So in the montane parts of Alberta, we actually have a pretty good sense of fire activity, and it's in the 30 to 50 year range. So really frequent. And we're not even close to that. No. So the estimates we made just on a simulation exercise was that it would have to increase by 4 to 5 times for a period of about 50 years, which is virtually impossible.
For sure.
Right? To put that much fire on the landscape.
Safely.
Yeah,
for sure. Because the truth of the matter is, as much as we want to let fires go, we can't let them go because they're going to take out homes, they're going to kill people. It's just not. We created a powder keg that we are having trouble handling for sure. Yeah. Okay, so, and this is difficult because it depends on. I mean, as an average across Alberta, or say across Canada, we'll say, how much of the forest should be broken up into individual stages? Just roughly, like, should you have an equal amount of, should you have 10% of every stage, or is there a different kind of way to manage that?
Yeah, there's
what I'm trying to get at is so you said right now we have more mature, not old, but going to be old forests than historically has ever been in existence. So how much is that relative to what should be there?
I'm going to dodge that question.
I don't blame you.
And address it by using a previous discussion that we had. This is a situation where we just want to stop the movement of the current condition from being too far away from the historic one,
right?
And start to move it back.
Okay.
So, what can we do? Understanding that this is an issue, and it's fraught with challenges that are social and economic and ecological. What can we do to start to create more younger forest in certain ecosystem types? And
so we're so far past what it should be that we just need to start moving that back direction. Don't even pay attention to where it needs to be. Just getting back there.
In some cases, that's true. But even in the cases where in the situations where we're not quite past yet, we're going to be. And we know all we have to do is play out the scenario that we call business as usual, which is this is how much harvesting is going to happen, and we almost know that. But it can only happen on a certain percentage of the landscape.
Sure.
And we can factor in how much fires we might get in the future. We know the current condition is going to continue to start to get older.
Okay.
So what can we do to change that? And I would say that those discussions are happening now. So so for example, in fire management, in a fire management situation, if you knew that there was a fire that was happening, for example, in the fire was heading towards an area that had no values at risk. So there was no towns, no oil and gas installations, and it was treed wetland. Like that's a situation where you want to say, let's see if we can let this fire go as far as it can, because having young, black spruce forest type is something that we want to encourage. And so we can do this one step at a time by introducing another layer of decision making into fire management.
That needs to happen at the top level. We're not telling wildfire fighters to let fires heading towards black spruce go.
Very strategic. very strategic. Very strategic. And this is something that Alberta is talking about.
Sure.
Right. I mean, the devil's in the details, right?
For sure. Yeah.
And that's and there are risks involved.
I can see the headline now. Politicians let towns burn down, right? Because so
and all it takes is one.
Yeah.
Just one, probably the wrong cabin, right?
Yeah.
He'll be a friend of the minister, and we're done.
Yeah.
Right. So it's pretty risky. And the other opportunity that I would say discussions are, very quietly happening around, but again, huge risk would be, and again, not necessarily in Alberta, but I would say in Canada in general, I'm speaking. Would be integrating fire with harvesting. So how can we start to reintroduce fire into these systems where they used to be, and get it back to doing it safely? So Jasper National Park is the best example of this. They had their Fire Smart program combined. It started with mechanical. They had to do the thinning out.
Sure. And
the goal was to get it to the point where then they could start to light lower intensity fires and have them start to move through there, with the occasional assistance from mechanical. So we're at the point now where in a lot of these ecosystems we can't light a match. There's it's too volatile.
Well, there's so many people that just want to go, well, just leave it be, let it be natural. It's like, it's not natural. This is
no, but the problem is Mother Nature's going to take care of it one way or the other, right? And
she has no regard for our interests.
No, and it's going to be, it's either going to be eventually it's going to be a really bad wildfire, right?
Yeah.
And now you start to risk other parts of the ecosystem. The fires last year, for example, in the interior of BC, they sent out crews to do surveys to figure out what parts of that fire might not grow trees in the next generation, because it burned so hot. It took the A horizon, the where all the yummy nutrients are in the soil. It's gone, and part of the B horizon. And in some cases, it burned so hot that it essentially created a waxy surface on the soil, so water couldn't penetrate. It would run right over top. So we've got...
That's bananas. Like, to think that that's the situation we've gotten ourselves into, is that, I mean, and that probably would have happened in select locations naturally, but now it's happening on a large scale.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those fires in BC historically were not that hot. And again, we as humans created the situation where there was enough fuel there that they burned that hot. And it's not unrealistic to think that parts of Alberta could experience the same thing. And again, when you think of a fire, it's not all, we see fires on the news, and they're the ones that make the news, which is the flames that go 300 feet in the air and the big smoke columns. And then afterwards it's desolate. There's not a living thing.
Yeah.
Those are highly unusual fires historically.
Right.
A lot of the fires will maybe never even crown. They'll just burn along on the forest floor under very moderate conditions, and they might do it for several days or several weeks, and then they'll go out. There'll be fires in between that we call it candling. It'll take the occasional tree and it'll stay in the crowns for a little while, and then it'll drop down and go back into the crown and drop down and leave a lot of residual behind. So there's fires of all levels of severity out there. And if you think about it, the ones that we're going to be most successful at putting out are going to be the low and moderate severity fires. Of course. Those are the ones that are probably creating most of the diversity on the landscape and creating a lot of the barriers to future fires. Right. But we've had great success putting them out, and we're having less success at putting them out now because those opportunities aren't out there.
We're just trying to take care of the giant ones now. Yeah.
Well, because we don't have any. There's not much area left that has the opportunity for a low to moderate fire. So that's
because it's all mature and it's all ready to blow.
Well, there's a big chunk of it is, right?
Yeah.
So
sure. Yeah, it's concerning. It's definitely a problem that takes a lot of minds, but I'm sure we can figure it out somehow.
Well, as I said, it's probably a problem you want to bite away at and do what you can and start to think about changing policies. And I think, to be honest, and I've not the first time I've said this, we have to start thinking of forest management as a land management tool.
Totally.
Right? Yes, it provides a resource, but start to think of it strategically. Where do we want it? What do we want the landscape to look like? And how can we use forest management to help us move those landscapes back
totally
to where we something more natural. And I'm not saying, again, it doesn't have to be within the natural range, and climate change, of course, is going to change things, but still our general agreement, our best bet against climate change is to have a dynamic, heterogeneous, resilient landscape. And right now we're heading in the opposite direction. We're creating homogeneous landscapes with lower levels of diversity. So we want to reverse that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think pretty much everyone can get on board with that one. And yeah, that's kind of how I've always seen forestry myself, is that I've seen timber as a means to pay for landscape management. You know what I mean? Rather than having to tax, get public dollars to pay for it or something like that. Now you've got this sustainable, renewable resource, right, that you can harvest. And if you do it sustainably, it can pay for this landscape management, right? And it'll look a lot different than we're currently doing it, right? Like, it's always going to be changing. We're always going to be doing different things. But yeah, I think that's the way to do it. It makes sense to me anyways. But
well, yeah. I mean, it's turning the world on its head, right? Because now we're talking about forest management as a tool, but a positive tool.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually creating benefits to to landscape health.
Yeah.
Which, you know, and I'm sounding, you know, I realize I'm sounding like, you know, that's easy to say, well, okay, well, he's, you know, a shill for forest management, but
Right.
but really, what are the other options?
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of getting out of options,
Mm-hmm.
because, as I said, it would be nice to say, let's reintroduce fire as a tool,
Mm-hmm.
but, you know, we're about 20 or 30 years too late.
Yeah.
On most of these landscapes.
It's just not manageable anymore. We can't do it. Yeah.
The risk is just not acceptable.
Yeah.
So what we do is we sit and wait, and we increase our efforts to fight mountain pine beetle and fires, but eventually Mother Nature's going to win.
Harvesting is a controlled way to try to supplement some of that lack of burning, but it's definitely not the whole answer. Obviously we need a lot more. So what do you think forest management is going to look like in the future? You mentioned before saying harvesting with fire as well, like you know what I mean, using the two together somehow. What do you mean by that? How's that going to look?
Well, for prescribed fire and fire behavior specialists, the trick is to understand, you know, your fuel complex and what you've got.
Mm-hmm.
So if forest management could be used as a tool to manipulate fuels, either, and I'm thinking in this case in advance of burning. So you do forestry first, then burning.
Okay.
That could reduce the risk to an acceptable level.
Gotcha.
But, you know, it's really a new technique, and you know, the fire behavior guys listening to this may be thinking, no, it's the opposite. You know, we're going to go in and, you know, maybe it's manipulating, doing fire first and then coming back in with forestry. But I would tend to think,
what would you be burning and what would you be
former.
cutting? Just to clarify.
Well, I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not sure what that looks like. Again, nobody's done it.
Okay.
I'd be dying to get those people in a room and say, figure it out.
Yeah.
Let's talk about making sure that forestry is not going to do it unless they make a profit, right? So they can't do it at a loss, and the fire guys aren't going to do it unless the risk drops to an acceptable level. So how can
where's the pocket?
The fuel be manipulated, the harvesting, the trees taken out, that creates an acceptable prescription window for the fire guys to say, yep, I'm okay with this, and I'm okay to light it up, and I've got enough fuel to do it. I mean, the risk is if you take too much out, you're not going to get a fire going. So it's got to be something substantial, and it probably can't be a little area. Right?
For sure. Yeah, no, we can't be doing like, oh, we did 100 hectares, right? It's like, no,
well,
we need. Yeah.
Well, we might need to start small, but the idea, this may even be turning the whole idea of what a prescribed burn on its head. You know, how do we light them? How do we manage them? So I think it's going to be challenging everybody to start to think differently. And even, so I think that's a part of it. And, you know, as to the future, I don't know where it's going.
You can speculate, but it's not.
I've got, you know, it's easy for me. I'm not a manager. I'm not a politician, right? I'm just a an academic with, you know, an unrealistic version of the world. But I think where we have to go is more collaborative planning, whether it's fire and forest management, whether it's forest management and parks, or forest management companies starting to work together across borders, forest management companies and oil and gas companies, and that's already those relationships are already starting to form. But if we can't manage a whole landscape without everybody being a part of the management,
totally,
but communicating with each other, as opposed to, oh, who put that road in over there? I didn't know that was happening. Yeah. Right. And and you know, it's and as I say, we're already moving towards that, I would say, but there's no carrots to do it, and at this point, so I think there's a lot of things that a lot of switches that have to be thrown.
It's a long
to make
road
that happen, and it's and again, it's baby steps. Approach this in pieces. We're not going to just one day be there.
No, for sure. And that even when we do start doing this, it's going to be our understanding is going to change again, and we're going to have another thing that we need to add to the piece, right? So it's
and we need to bring, I think, all of the stakeholders along for the ride. Again,
Totally.
keep the door open. It's like we'll talk about this together from the start, and because if you introduce something, as radical as fire and forest management working together to a group that wasn't a part of it, you might as well start all over again.
Yeah.
Right. They have to be there from the start, listening to all the discussions and being a part of it. And then everybody accepts, some responsibility for what's going on.
Yep.
And the other scary part of this is that the classical roles have to disappear. And the most obvious one is that regulators have to start sharing the role of managers. Ultimately it's provincial land. And yes, there's 10 years for forest management out there. But especially their role as in terms of fire management, being the fire managers, they're going to have to start to be managers in part.
Totally.
And
it needs to be collaboration. I mean, it can't be. Everyone needs to be discussing with everybody, right? It can't be. I'm responsible for the trees. You're responsible for the bears. You're responsible for the insects. It has to be. Everyone has to be talking all the time in order for this to work properly. For sure. Yeah. And I think it seems like, to me at least, we're heading in that direction. But like you said, it's difficult. People have a hard time accepting change, so it's going to take some time. But I like that we're heading in that direction, and I think I have a positive outlook for the future. I don't know what we're going to run into in the interim. We'll see, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree, and I wouldn't be here if I didn't think it was we were going in the right direction. It's still something I believe in, and I know there's a group of people who believe in this too, and it's a journey, right? And so that's the questions that I've dodged today is largely because it's great to speculate, but there's a lot of what's going to be happening, even a year, 5 years, 10 years from now, where we're going to be. But I think the important thing is to get on that bus or train together. Yeah, it's like, okay, we're gonna accept this is a journey, and to a degree we have to accept that EBM is something that we aspire to. Yeah, and we may never get there, but we don't have to worry about getting there. I think it's continual improvement, best available knowledge, being willing and able to be flexible, and
let's keep trying.
Yeah, and there's still there's a lot that can be done. I don't think we're even close to throwing our hands up in the air.
No. I mean, we could sit forever and discuss and try and discern the science. I mean, and try and figure out what's right? Like everyone, we all know academics who will take 10 years to do a paper, not because they needed that long, but because they don't want to be incorrect, and they want to check and recheck and recheck and recheck everything to make sure everything is perfect, right? But the truth is the needle's always moving, right? So the truth is, at some point we just need to pull the trigger on something and start heading in a direction and adjust course, because otherwise nothing's going to be accomplished. So it's going to be slow, because society's slow at making changes, but when the opportunities happen, I think we need to take them.
Well, and the not doing anything is still a decision. And that's a hard thing for people to recognize.
Yeah, totally.
Right. And there's two reasons for not making a decision. One is, just there's too many decisions. I can't make a choice. I'm not making one. Yeah. And two, the perception that it's just safer not to do anything. And that second one is really dangerous.
Bystander effect.
Because if we, by not making a decision, by not deciding we have to start to deal with this now, we're just handing a bigger problem off to the next generation.
Yeah, like you said.
But maybe the next generation will be minus 5 towns in Alberta by the time it happens because of fire.
Yep. No, actually, this is kind of funny. My last night, we were driving home, my wife and I, and we drove past a guy that was like in a wheelchair. Looked like he was passed out or something like that, right? And my wife, immediately, she's like, we need to stop and check on this guy. And I was like, well, he's fine. He's just passed out. He's drunk. Like, he's okay, right? And she's like, well, I was like, and there's other people going by. Like it's a busy street. Someone will get to him, right? She's like, that's what everybody thinks. And then she told me the story of the situation that happened down in the States where this woman was being brutalized and in an apartment complex, and it was a hot day. Everyone had their windows open, and she was screaming, and everyone could hear it. And she ended up dying. And the next day, the police came around, went to everybody's apartment. Like, oh yeah, I heard it, but I figured someone else would call the cops. And it's an interesting analogy for that, right? Like, not making a choice is making a choice. And we need to be, when those opportunities arise, don't expect the next person to do it. You need to be the one to do it. Otherwise, we're always going to be stuck here, just, not accomplishing anything. So,
and to be fair, I don't know if I'd want to be the politician who says we're going to do this.
Yeah, for sure.
And under their watch, something burns down.
But at some point, politicians need to grab their, you know what I mean? They just need to grab it, and they need to put their name on the table and say, I'm going to do something that's right, not something that's going to get me elected. Because ultimately, if you had asked, people look back at Theodore Roosevelt, right? He created almost all of the conservation lands in the United States. Everyone looks back at him now and say, what an amazing president. Like he had all this foresight to see that we needed this, and that, the problems with not having it would have happened. Right. But at the time, if you look back, everyone hated him. Everyone thought he was an idiot. Like, no, you don't need to do that. We need private enterprise. We need this, we need that, we need the other thing. Right. We have a hard time seeing the truth when we're standing, amongst the complexity of the social situation. So yeah, but anyways, that's a different conversation about politicians and crazy shit.
We're drifting again,
but we're done. We're done here. So you have any final thoughts? Any way when you want to wrap this up? Any kind of advice to people working in the industry or doing academia? How can we move in this direction and become better?
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm about to go and talk to the FRI board tomorrow, and I always have it's almost. I have my, what's it called? The Pechu Kucha. You have 6 minutes to make your point.
Okay.
That's it. You're cut off. It's more or less like that. And I always look for different ways of paraphrasing or of describing what the Healthy Landscapes program does. So I've been thinking about this a lot. We have enough science right now. We understand, we're far from understanding the entire ecosystem, but we've got the big chunky pieces figured out,
right?
And we already know, where things are deviating, and we have a pretty good idea what those consequences are. There is, so I would say, in the science we keep. I'm not saying don't invest in science, but I would say the issue now is engagement and dialogue, and so the advice to everybody would be, get engaged in this, whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing. Bring it up, start talking about it, and the more everyone starts talking about this and starts getting engaged, the better it is. Whether it's positive or negative, we're having the discussion. Yeah, and I think
we'll suss out the reality of it,
and that's where we need to be. And I one of my mottos over the last few years is, whenever anyone asks me to give them a talk, no matter where they are, I find a way to do it, because that means they've gotten to the point where they're saying, well, let's find out more about this. Let's ask Dave to come. And I always say yes.
And if you don't engage, then someone else might not either, right? And you might be the only one they approach.
Or it's perceived as, we're not interested in your opinion. Yeah. Right? And that's not true. So
open, honest discussion for sure.
Just get it out there and get involved.
Totally.
And keep talking about it. That would be the advice.
Awesome. No, I like it. That's good. That's where it all starts, right? Just having these conversations. That's how you make social change, right? So awesome. Good stuff, man. Well, this is great. I think we covered a whole ton of ground. So
more than I thought we would.
Yeah, for sure. No, I appreciate you coming on. Maybe we can do this again sometime when we've got, I guess, when we don't cover the same ground over and over again, something more specific, I guess.
Sure. Yeah.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. I know I really enjoyed it. We always get a little bit philosophical, but that's the good stuff, right? So thanks a lot for listening. And remember to rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff. Helps me out. And I got a lot of good stuff coming for you guys. So we'll catch you next time.